Morning. This presentation with Claire and this discussion actually is going to top off the 2 days of programming that we have regarding New Mexico's global relevance. I'd like to acknowledge Yuridia Morales, who's here with us from Global Ties Albuquerque again. Hi, Yuri. And we are now recording and we are live. So I just want to make sure that everybody is aware of that. And the chat is open, so if you guys have any questions, please feel free to indicate via chat or raise your hand or chime in, and I'll be moderating during this time. So it's a real pleasure to introduce Claire Stasiewicz. I like doing the Stasiewicz part. But Claire has been my student for a very, very long time, and is now a PhD candidate at the University of Rotterdam, Erasmus University. And her work and her life's work for a very long time now has been focused on craft and creative economy. And she has worked in various aspects in the state of New Mexico on promoting and being part of the supportive ecosystem for the craft economy. So I thought it would be a really great way to cap off thinking about New Mexico, because Claire thinks about the social, public, and cultural aspects of craft and creative economy, and then we can have a conversation about how that impacts and how we think about New Mexico. So just as a connector, we heard a very wonderful presentation from Juan yesterday and his entrepreneurial journey as a craft entrepreneur here in relation to coffee. And the way that he thinks about that is something that that is very, very similar to the way that Claire situates her work and the way that she situates the idea of craft as an important concept within the state. So you guys all had access to the video that she produced. It was the YouTube video that I sent out to you guys. But Claire is going to summarize, and then we're just going to move into a discussion. I have some questions that will prompt a discussion, but everybody feel free to chime in at that point. Thank you so much, Claire, for joining us.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, guys. Can everyone hear me okay? We're good on audio and stuff?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. So I'm going to see if I can share my screen. Maybe. Let's see. Oh, maybe it's going to take a second. Sorry. But in the meantime, so if you didn't have a second to watch the video, I wanted to summarize it. But, oh, wait. All right. I don't think I'm going to be able to share my screen. That's fine. To summarize, basically, I want to start by saying, what is the creative economy? So John Hawkins basically said that it includes all the sectors whose goods and services are based on intellectual property. So when we think of creative, I think most people sort of start right out with art. That's a big one. But it includes design, fashion, publishing, music. They even include games and toys, video games, software development, architecture, TV and radio. It's actually really quite a broad concept, right? So that's something to note in case you didn't catch the video. So in New Mexico specifically, we have a ton of cultural institutions that would be part of the creative economy. Some big ones that you probably think of off the bat would be all of the markets in Santa Fe, the Indian market, Spanish market, and the international folk art market. But there's also, of course, oh, real quick, sorry, I'll send this to Manuel, to Dr. Montoya, and then we can see it. Sorry, give me a sec. These markets that I mentioned in the video are huge and some of the largest in the United States. And so something I think about a lot is, why is New Mexico specifically have such a strong creative economy? And I think there are lots of factors. One of them would be our, sorry, I'm sending this, sorry. Our mix of cultures within the state. We are exposed to so many different cultures compared to a lot of different places in the country. And so that's actually what my research focuses on, is why there are specific communities across the United States where craft, specifically handmade goods, are so valued. So let's see if we can get that presentation real quick. Let's see. And I think the third slide, once it comes up, is all about some of the institutions in New Mexico that are part of the creative economy. And they're oftentimes pretty surprising what can be considered part of the creative economy. Perfect. So yeah, so that's the first slide, just pretty general. If we can go, let's see, to the third one. All right, so yeah, what's the creative, there we go, perfect. Okay, so some of these institutions here, these are all spaces that you can visit and physically go into, but I think with creative economy, it's important to mention that it includes so much more than just these physical spaces that you can interact with. It's all of, again, the intellectual property that goes alongside of it. So for example, UNM has one of the only flamenco programs in the world. So if you want to study flamenco, you can come to UNM and do that. That's an example of sort of that long institutional history that would allow, that New Mexico allows us to interact with the creative economy in that way. And I also think about all of the individuals who create, and that obviously has, you know, sort of runs the gamut, but I work part-time at a local brewery, and I always think of how like our marketing and our design team are absolutely part of creative economy development in the US, or in New Mexico. Yeah, let's see, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so I think this is probably maybe the most important one. Why New Mexico? So as I was saying before, integration and exposure to a lot of different cultures. We have groups in New Mexico that have a deep history of cultural engagement. Because of the way that New Mexico was colonized, we had early on for hundreds of years, this sort of cultural engagement together of different groups. We also have wonderful low startup costs for newer organizations. I think that's a huge part of why things like Netflix have come to New Mexico and are coming to New Mexico. We also have a huge film industry here that I think contributes to that. For artists themselves, the cost of living here is way cheaper. It's a lot easier to be here and support yourself as an artist than it would be someplace like San Francisco or New York. And because Santa Fe is the third best city in America for the arts, I think that was from 2018, it has sort of a reputation for the arts, or for any part of the creative economy. Okay, so those are some reasons that New Mexico is great for the creative economy. So then, yeah, I think the final thing that I like to mention when we talk about this is concerns with this sort of creative economy development, issues that might come up. So one of the biggest ones, when you are working with multiple cultures, would be cultural appropriation. This is something I saw sometimes at the International Folk Art Market when I worked there. It's oftentimes unintentional. No one necessarily attempts to appropriate someone else's culture, but misunderstanding how to use maybe a piece of art that you purchase from someone, or the tendency for it's hard, I'm trying to say it, like, I'm not quite sure how to say it, but there are issues, of course, of like the decline of traditions alongside cultural assimilation. So when we talk about globalization, a lot of people think that globalization means westernization. And if we think about the arts and cultural groups in New Mexico, that's also potentially an issue. Another big one for New Mexico, an issue would be brain drain. One of those Bieber reports in 2017 showed that New Mexico was basically the lowest state for net migration. And net migration is when people leave the state. So mostly young people and young families were found to be the ones primarily leaving the state. And that's an issue because that when we lose our young educated class of people, we find it harder to be successful as a state. So I guess my first question, if we're gonna open up a discussion, would be other issues that we might find. That's just a really brief summary of the video. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it for the summary. Okay, questions?
I have a leading question, just because it's on my mind right now, and it's there's two things that I observed when I looked at your video and when I think about your work. One of them is that the creative economy is probably, you mentioned, and we have discussions about how the creative economy is one of the most resilient parts of the global economy. So it constitutes 5% of GDP across the world. Here in New Mexico, it's more than that. But one of the reasons that it is such a thriving and resilient part is that it's really built off of and driven sometimes by conflict and tension. So you notice, for example, you worked with artists in South Sudan, and many of these artists who basically their mode of survival is both the protection of their traditions, which is something they're trying to defend, at the same time that they're trying to take care of basic needs and services. And so the creative economy becomes a vehicle for that. We're living in a time when survival and basic needs are becoming an important practice. How do you think about what's happening with COVID-19 and the racial tensions across this country and the world? How is that contributing to this concept of creative economy, and what are we doing in New Mexico that you think is trending towards being more of a creative economy as a result of that?
Wow, that's a great question. I think COVID-19 in general, the pandemic, has encouraged people to, I think people are having to make more difficult decisions, maybe because, unemployment has risen so high. There are all these tensions. And so I think creative outlets have become, well, one, an outlet for individuals. So I know a lot of, anecdotally, a lot of friends and things are taking up craft, or like making things by hand, are getting back into their art because they're stuck at home and they have more time. Art is also a very therapeutic thing for a lot of people, so I think that that's contributing to it. And then I think there's a trend towards putting your money where your mouth is. So purchasing things that are going to support the people that you want to be supporting. And so, we see Amazon made so much more money this quarter than they have before, and yet we're losing all these local businesses. And there are so many people that believe that those local businesses are a valuable part of our economy, and creative economy absolutely relates to those businesses, right? Local businesses oftentimes support local artisans. And so I think those relationships are strengthening, and people are being encouraged and actually are going out and spending their money more thoughtfully. I think that's something that's happening. Now in New Mexico, I'm not sure. I think I've been interested that during this, even though a lot of museums and things are closed, we're moving them online. People are trying still to engage with those institutions despite how challenging it is. I know slowly some of our museums are reopening in New Mexico, like by appointment only. And I've been pretty amazed that people are wanting to go out and have those experiences despite what's going on with the pandemic, and despite, maybe personal struggles that people are having. I don't know if that totally gets to your question, but.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. I have some thoughts that I'll follow up on, but I encourage anybody else, any questions that anybody else has.
Ask a question.
I have a question. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
This is Ashley. Good morning, Claire. Thank you so much for uploading the video. I think your video was really fascinating and got so many of us interested in this topic. So thank you for that. Something that I caught in your video that was really interesting to me, you mentioned that, people are so drawn to the creative economy now because we're turning into a society that really values like reliable or valuable pieces. And so we're kind of becoming more minimalistic and that makes people interested in buying items from local artists. But you also mentioned that local artists in New Mexico are not able to fully survive off of their art, and they're not able to make a livable income off of their art, which is really sad. Do you know why that is? If more people are interested in buying art, why are these artists not able to make a living? It's really unfortunate, and I'm just really interested why that is.
That's a great question. So I think it's a lot of different things. One, I think a lot of artists struggle with valuing their own work and knowing how much to charge for their work, and the value of it. And so I think that's a huge issue. And it comes down to, I think, an educated versus an uneducated consumer class. So there are parts of the world, I think one of my favorite examples is Japan, where most people who live there understand and recognize a quality kimono, and they can tell the difference between a quality handmade one and a knockoff. And it's because those sorts of ideas of the value of a handmade good are more ingrained into them. I'm not totally sure why. That's part of why I do this research. But we don't necessarily have that here in the United States. We're not necessarily exposed to or taught to value an artist's time. And I think part of it goes to like our education system. Honestly, it's kind of deep rooted where what are the first things that schools cut when a budget is tight? Arts and music, right? We of course emphasize learning of, math and language arts, and that's extremely important, but because we don't necessarily lift up the career of an artist, we devalue those individuals at the start. We devalue those career paths. And so because of that, we don't necessarily give the right economic input to those people that they might deserve. I know a lot of working in the arts is people expect you to do it for free almost. I've experienced this personally, working for as a consultant for different arts organizations. A lot of it is just your own time. You're not going to get paid for it, and that's because people want to put their money into things that they think are important, and arts are sometimes seen as frivolous. I also think another component of it, trends toward minimalism are phenomenal, but it's really expensive to purchase some handmade goods. And again, it should be expensive because they're quality products. They're probably sustainably produced, we would hope. And people take so much time to create them. So of course they should be highly priced. But there's that barrier to entry for a lot of the population that I'm not gonna buy the $40 plate that was handmade by this artist. I can't afford that. I'm gonna buy one that kind of looks like it at Target. And I get that. But again, I think there are all these class and demographic things that go along with the relationship between artist and patron, in this case, or buyer. I think New Mexico is a place where we have a great, especially Santa Fe, we have a lot of people there that really respect and understand the value of art and how hard it is to create things. And I think that's one of the reasons we're successful in the creative economy here. So that was a lot, sorry, but
can I
great
add
question.
To that?
Yeah.
Do you mind if I add to that a little bit? I worked in the creative economy for several years, and I actually want to eventually open up my own business. What I've seen in New Mexico, and I can only speak to New Mexico, is that a lot of artists are taught various arts and how to create, whether it's like retablos or carvings or pottery or silversmithing. They're taught this craft from generation to generation, but they're not taught how to brand themselves, how to market themselves, how to even, like you said, how to price or value their work, and then how to make the sale. There's this whole art of negotiation that has to then take place, and a lot of them also don't have the time to learn all of that, because as soon as they make a sale, they're making the next set of of items to sell so they can put food on the table. And so it's like this, almost like this sad cycle that they're in, because as soon as they make a sale, they're rushing to make another sale, or, you know, they don't have money for food or to pay electricity. And another thing that I see in New Mexico is some folks will try to make a sale and they will get into this negotiation where they end up selling, you know, it's a lot of people, powerful people with a lot of money that start to try to buy in bulk and will haggle for the lowest possible price. And they end up not making a whole lot of money off of that sale. And I don't know, that whole situation, it's very heartbreaking. And I hope to someday open up my own business, and I would like to represent artists and do all of that for them. And by doing that, I want to eliminate the middleman. I don't want to work with wholesalers because they're the ones that kind of end up taking a big chunk of the pie. And if I can put that chunk back in their pocket, I think it can be a win-win situation. I think the end consumer is still probably going to pay just as much. If I can get it to a point where they're paying a little bit less, then everybody wins. But that's what I've seen. They don't know how to market themselves or create a brand, or, you know, they don't have not to say that you need a business degree, but you learn a lot of that in school. And some of them don't have, you know, passed a high school education, and some of them live in rural communities and didn't even graduate from high school. And so I really think that a lot of them could use an advocate like that or some kind of training. I've seen, forgive me, I'm going to mess this up. The organization that runs the Indian market, is it Swaga? I don't know.
I think, or some, yeah.
They've started a program, I believe, where they're actually educating their artists and trying to teach them some of those skills. But I do think here in New Mexico, a lot of them get taken advantage of, and it's a really sad situation.
Absolutely. And it was hard this year because those markets were canceled, right? So a great thing that the International Folk Art Market does is it helps the artists set a price for their product. We do training with those international artists and do a costing and pricing workshop. So we say like, okay, how we figure out the time it took to make the product, the material cost of the product, and then from there, we decide how much we're going to set the price at. And at that market, people aren't allowed to haggle, actually. So that's a really great thing there, is that those artists are going to get the value of their work that they deserve. And that was maybe an unpopular choice, to be honest. But with COVID-19, with these markets being canceled, I really wanted to, similar to you, create an opportunity somehow to maybe like go get those pieces of art and bring them here to local businesses that would be willing to just sell them, you know, be a storefront for them for free, which would be so cool. I haven't done that because time is, you know, limited, but that's a great point, and that idea is amazing.
So we got a couple of comments, and then we'll go to the raised hands. Destiny says, love how well this ties in with the general demand for what we purchase, having an interesting story, like our coffee conversation yesterday. Totally true. Agree 100%. Laura says, the hardest part for me as a designer was understanding the value of intangible work. Agreed on the for free aspect too. Everything is something I could use in my portfolio. That's also very true. We're going to talk about value chain analysis in our next class, which is going to be extremely important to that. And then Paul has his hand raised, so I'll let him kind of connect that together. Paul?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Which Paul?
Uh-oh.
Professor Montoya.
Looks like Paul S.
You go right ahead,
asked
Paul.
the question. I'm not going to try and say your
okay.
last name.
All right, sure. Yeah, so basically, I really like how you were focusing on how artists undervalue their work. I've seen this happen repeatedly, both personally and professionally. And I was hoping that you could provide some specific suggestions how you think we as a culture should change to change that particular idea, and specifically how we as EMBA students might be able to find ourselves personally in a place where we can change some of those concepts and those ideas?
Great question. As far as how, as we as a culture can help artists value their work, or how we can learn to value their work, I think it starts with education, really. Again, valuing people who work with their hands more, valuing people following career paths that aren't necessarily like, I mean, what is a traditional career path? It seems silly that that's an idea, but like, I don't know, growing up, I feel like my high school was like, if you should be a doctor and a lawyer, you should go to college. Oh, you do art, that's cool, but you know, what are you going to do with that? And I got a degree in art history, and I can't tell you the number of people who said, made those comments of, all right, so are you going to work at McDonald's for the rest of your life? I'm like, well, what if I do? There's nothing wrong with that, first of all. And so I think it comes down to education and teaching people that there is value in people doing different things than what is considered good in our culture. And then as far as what you can do as EMBA students, I think supporting the arts with your money, that's something we can all do, of course. But I think Alicia's idea of creating educational opportunities to teach artists how to value their work, you will all walk away with a degree that allows you to teach other people about business. Because you understand how businesses function, there's no reason why you couldn't assist artists in some capacity, or cultural institutions that you care about, maybe it's music or something, and facilitate those people being able to value their own work, do their bookkeeping, all that stuff. Because I think it just comes down to education on both sides, if that helps.
Yeah, thank you. Real quick follow-up question. Do you know anybody here in Albuquerque who's doing any work on the business art relationship? Like any organizations that we could reach out to?
That's a good question. Dr. Montoya, would you know of some? I feel like organizations in Albuquerque that are trying to connect businesses and artists.
Yeah, so we have a few. One of them, I guess the premier one in the state is Creative Startups, right? So we have Creative Startups with Tom Agason and Alice Loy. They're one of the groups that does a lot of that in an international context. And then the markets, the organizations that support the markets that Claire has talked about are probably principally involved in that as stakeholders. And then there are several, particularly amongst our indigenous communities, there's 3 or 4 that are sponsored by banks. So there's actually a Native American entrepreneurial work group that offers a fellowship for artists in residence from our tribal communities. And what I'm going to do is, if it's helpful, I'm going to actually put a list of those inside of a folder, probably in Claire's folder in the Learn presentation, so that you guys get web links to all of those people, as many as I can name at least. And Kathy's right, the Rainforest and Rob Del Campo and the Innovation Academy does quite a bit of that. West does a massive amount of that. They actually have an entire subset of programming that is specifically geared towards the arts community. And then there are the kind of the professional clusters like Fat Pipe, Albuquerque, and what is it, a million cups, or what is that's the kind of entrepreneurial meeting ground. So there's a bunch of them. And actually, to Juan's point, over the past 5 years, there has been a brand new conversation about the intangibility of goods and why New Mexico is suited for that. So there's quite a few of them. 1 million cups, that's correct. Yeah, and Destiny has put in a few as well. So they're out there. They're out there. But it's also about an institutional and cultural conversation that Claire's referring to, and your concept of the commons, Claire.
Yeah, and the commons is just an in-depth way to look at groups of people or communities. But that's sort of what I'm focusing on is how these groups form and how they end up lifting up art as a concept. And so in the US, I think New Mexico is a great example. And then the other one that I'll be looking at in my research is actually Amish communities, I think. I'd hope to look at those because that's another really interesting place where people start to, they understand that like Amish products, for example, are supposed to be of high quality. And it's like, okay, well, why do we think that? Why do we associate those things together? And so that's, yeah, what I'll be looking at.
Okay, we got Mandy next.
Hi, Claire, I want to thank you for joining us today and sending us your video ahead of time. In your presentation and in this conversation, one of the things that continues to fascinate me is sort of the complicated relationship with creatives and money. I think, you know, one of the things that I'm a business owner here in Albuquerque. I grew up with an artist father. I have an artist husband. And one of the things that I often think of is that there's this continual tension around, I'll use the word gentrification because it's the one that gets the bad rap. But for me, what's really interesting is, you know, as a business owner, and I think many of us, like, we want the development, we want things like Netflix to come here, we want economic development and economic stimulation, and how do we continue to have all of that happen and still create a container that supports artists, artisans, the creatives that often get ousted by this kind of development. That's such a, it's such a complicated thing for me, and I think about it all the time because I want both. And I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
It's a great question, and really challenging. I don't know if there's a simple answer. When we have, I guess, you know, as our city becomes more successful, or our state, and people come in, you know, for Netflix and things like that, I'm looking at like even the real estate market right now. It's really increasing. It's becoming more and more expensive to live here. And so, yeah, you're right that these artists who maybe are working on a smaller wage will be potentially ousted. And so I think, you know, what we have to rely on is, in part, like our local officials, our government, to support keeping those individuals in the cities in New Mexico. And part of that is like economic relief programs, like different housing programs that we have. I'm actually working right now on a project. We're developing something, a new arts center that'll be in the Sawmill District. And it's a collaboration between 516 Arts and Outpost Performance Space. And they're creating a 40 to 50 apartment unit complex alongside a massive, like 30,000 square foot gallery and performing arts space. And the combination of these things, I think, is so valuable, right? So when we develop projects that include people both in the arts and in sort of more general other economic areas like real estate, for example, making those connections, I think, helps uplift both groups, right? The apartment people will probably be more successful because they have these great resources right at their doorstep. So a lot of renters will be attracted to that. And then the spaces themselves are profiting off of being connected to the rental space. And so I think that's an example maybe of a way that we can start doing that. And again, it's all about having these conversations and saying, hey, we have a problem. We don't want to lose these artists. What can we do to fix it? So good question.
Okay, we have, is it Jacob next? Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm going to have, I think, what's going to be a pretty unpopular opinion. But I think free market economics teaches us that that all products, art included, are going to be marketed around their, or priced at around their market value. And yeah, there may be some residual values, such as was discussed earlier, that, you know, maybe better marketing or something could help earn an additional value from the products. But I see art as kind of like professional sports. It's something that a lot of people do, a lot of people enjoy, but to say that it's something that a significant number of people are going to be able to earn a reasonable income from, And to imply that if that's not the case, that the consumer base needs to be somehow educated is disingenuous.
So I think you make a good point. My biggest example of this is Etsy. So Etsy is an online market space, basically, where people can sell goods. Typically, they're supposed to be handmade goods. People also sell vintage things, stuff like that. But the fact is that an artisan who has been trained for 20 years to, let's say, in carpentry, can exhibit his work alongside someone who is what I would call like a part-time crafter. And it's both, I think it's both a great sort of like, yeah, it was created in Albuquerque. It's like a level playing field in a sense where these people can be on the same plane, but it's really challenging for, I would say, the artisan that's been doing this for such a long time to show their quality on that online platform. And so, yeah, I don't know where I was going with that, sorry.
Well,
But,
I mean, so that just gets back to the free market economy, that there are people who have a high level of skill, and yes, some people will value that and decide to spend their own money on that. But for most people, that's not where they would choose to spend their money, and to imply that that's has something to do with a lack of education, or I don't think that's properly representing what's going on here. Some people, the mass-produced thing is good enough, and that's all they want. In this cohort, a few semesters back, we heard from an individual who has a company making Christmas products, and she markets hers as handmade, but we found that really all of her products are machine-made, but somehow they're marketed as handmade. And I think it comes down to what do consumers value and what is the market going to support.
right, well, I don't think that these artists would be here if they didn't think that there was value in their product, right? And so I think that people do value the arts and cultural.
Sure, I think they do, but there's nothing wrong in valuing something that's, just because someone spent a lot of time on something doesn't mean it has a market value that appropriately values, a market price that appropriately values that time.
Unless the value system changes, right? And values evolve. That's the thing that's missing from the free market perspective.
Well,
right? It assumes,
well, and then also
that, I'm sorry, Jacob?
It gets into what value does it add to the market? So some art definitely adds tremendous value to the market. That's why you have famous artists who are known throughout the world, because some art does add tremendous value, but some art doesn't.
Well, let me give you an example of the Amezcua weavers in Mexico. Claire knows this example really well. So these are weavers who are using basically an 800-year-old tradition. It's pre-Columbian, the type of weaving that they use. Actually, I'd like to yield on Claire on this, like if you want to add anything to this, but there was a moment when they got really popular and they actually started to produce their products for cruise ships. And there started to become kind of a new vocabulary for how people were valuing. It was actually trendy. We can call it trendy, right? So there was kind of a popularized value system that was making their work popular. One of the cool things about their weaving is that all of the designs are based on the alphabet from the Amezcua language, which UNESCO cites as actually a dying language. There was only 5,000 speakers in like 2010 or something like that. And the work that they were doing, they were actually intending to try to preserve the alphabet and to teach it to other people so that the language didn't die out. And so they got a lot of money. They actually had somebody that gave them like a brand new factory to build the stuff that they were doing. And they started to produce it. And Claire, if I'm not mistaken, there was this kind of moment when they actually changed their production process because of that. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so they initially were sitting in a circle on the ground weaving together, and their kids would come in the room and they would all work together and they would be able to teach the youth. And, it was this sort of like really ideal, beautiful thing. And when they started making money, a group of people came in, basically consultants, to try and help them with like marketing and things like that. And that group said, oh, you guys have money now. Why don't we get you some tables and chairs? Like, you'll be so much more comfortable that way. And so they brought in some tables and chairs, and they started working in a new format than they were before. And that language, that communication that they had, the teaching moment, all of those things went away. And they realized over maybe the course of 6 months to a year that they hated that. The reason to do the art is not necessarily always to sell the art. You can, you know, the value of it is not necessarily just, oh, I'm going to get $200 for this. It's, no, I'm passing on my culture. I'm passing on my traditions to my children, to my family. I am saving a language. I am saving intangible cultural heritage, and that is valuable. And the free market, traditional economics doesn't account for the human element, right? Yes, people will spend a certain amount of money in the market, but people don't buy things just for like use purpose, right? You don't buy a specific chair just because you need to sit down. You buy the specific chair because you like the way it looks or something special about it. And I think especially when people purchase things like art or handmade goods, the relationship between them and the artist might be the reason they buy it. Maybe like they just have a really great connection with the artist, and every time they look at that piece of art, they think of that person. I have on my desk this little guy that an artist from Peru gave me, and you know, it's like that connection between you and the person that created it and the story of it. All of those things are reasons people buy art. And so I think traditional economics doesn't capture the right framework for something like art or culture. And I think that's an issue for sure.
And to add to that.
So I agree that there's definitely value. There can be value in items and in art that is separate from its economic value, but you can't conflate those two values.
No.
Well, maybe we think of economics differently, because I study cultural economics, which is basically an offshoot of traditional economics. And so actually tries to account for and measure those social and cultural values of things. So I think.
Sure. So I think we're in agreement on that. That yes, there is value outside of economic value, but that doesn't necessarily translate into economic value. I don't want to keep.
I would totally disagree with that, Jacob. The problem is that markets, when we say free market, we just make this really broad stroke assumption about what a market is. And we assume that there's a separation between producers and consumers. And the example with the Amezcua weavers was a demonstration or an example of how the producers themselves are also consumers of their own good. They're part of the market. And so when you talk about a free market, what is being consumed, when we measure it, the theory of free market is actually beautiful. It could actually be universalized. But the problem is that we make these broad assumptions about what a market is. And unless you actually change what a market is and what that market value is, you're not gonna actually be able to translate them. But over time, that's what these hermeneutic concepts that Claire is working with kind of shows the value of. Anyway, I do want to move to Paul K. Paul K is next, then Kathy and Alicia.
All right, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. So I think a large part of this comes down to values. And in the US, art, I believe, is mainly bought on sentimentality. Whereas in some place like Japan, the best mangoes grown by a farmer might sell for $5,000. And they're really bought in support of the farmer and in recognition of his sort of supporting tradition and what he does, and because the culture wants to keep that around and they recognize it and they value it. And in the US, you know, art's just not viewed that way. It's more of a commodity item bought more on sentimentality, some sort of a connection to the artist or to the piece that reminds you of your past or some value that you have. And then the other piece of that growing up in Santa Fe, which I see a lot, is that the business side of art is pretty much antithetical to the ethos of an artist. And they largely ignore that side of the equation. And as a result of that, they get taken advantage of. You know, they're poor, they do need to make, well, they're not all poor, but, you know, they might need the money and they might be willing to come down in price in order to sell a piece, to buy more materials, to do whatever. And I think that's where one of the large issues stems. And sorry, more of a statement than a question.
I totally agree. And just thinking about, you know, the idea of like the poor artist, the starving artist, there's also on the flip side, when artists become successful, like they're considered sellouts in a sense. It's like, oh, you have money now, like, you know, maybe their art suffers because you have to have, you know, struggle to become a successful artist. There are all of these, I don't know, sort of weird tropes that we have in our minds. And I think it definitely impacts the way we value those individuals and their work.
Yeah, and sorry, that does bring up a good point. A lot of times the success of a member in a community is seen as a negative thing. You're getting ahead, and that community will do everything they can to pull that person back down for whatever reasons.
So true. A great example of that. Sorry, I want to get to the other questions, but at the folk art market, there was this group of artists from Madagascar that were they were so successful. They actually made a little documentary about them called The Silkies of Madagascar, which is an interesting one. And it was a cooperative of mostly women, and they wove these incredible scarves, and they came to the folk art market. One woman in particular came to represent the organization, the cooperative, and she almost became like famous at the folk art market. And so people were really lifting her up and all these things, and she made a ton of money. And she brought that money back to her community, and she was almost ousted from her community. Actually, she was physically ousted from her community. Was she stoned, Dr. Montoya? I believe she was actually
it was threatened, but she actually got out before that.
She got out before that happened. Okay, yeah. Basically, they said, get out or we will potentially kill you, because of her success and because of the way, I think because of the way that she was successful. So sad example, but yeah, that's definitely something that happens.
So we got Alicia, and then Beth, Debbie, and Dave.
Did Kathy get a go? I think Kathy was before me.
Kathy chimed in saying her question was answered.
Oh, okay. So in your video, you briefly touched on cultural differences, and kind of, I guess what stood out to me is you even mentioned like not helping, you know, people when they don't want to be helped kind of situations. And because I interact with artists a lot, I've been in those situations, and I've also had to learn the hard way how to navigate differences in culture. But I was wondering if you had any advice for us on how to, I guess, be more aware of those differences and how to navigate those waters, so that way we're not in situations where we're unintentionally, maybe for lack of a better word, insulting folks. I've been to all of the markets that you mentioned, and I love going to the International Folk Market. And I've seen those situations happen, you know, where you talked about folks kind of boasting about how much they spend on art every year, and yet they're talking to someone who, you know, probably makes a couple $1,000s a year, or, you know, whatever it might be, and can't even fathom having that much money, let alone wasting it, so to speak, on art. And so I don't know, I was just wondering if you could touch a little bit more on that, and any kind of recommendations that you might have for us.
Yeah, awesome question. I would say overall, try, and this is easier said than done, obviously, and this goes for really any aspect of life. It's like, don't make assumptions about people. One of my favorite things to experience at the folk art market is when people have an idea going in of what a folk artist is, and they assume that they're these rural, like quaint, simple people. And then they pull out their iPhone 11, and they put in their AirPods, and they're just like, you know, leaving your assumptions at the door, I think, is the first one. And then the second one would be to listen, to ask questions and listen. Most artists and craftspeople want to tell you about their work. it's their life, it's their passion. And so letting them speak to it and explain it to you, and you know, being an active support when they ask for it, as opposed to trying to encourage them to do something a specific way. A lot of times at the folk art market, when we would do trainings, I would see people trying to convince an artist to create something specific, or to change their supply chain in some capacity, or, oh, why don't you do it this way? Or why don't you do it that way? And it's like, well, maybe they do it the way they do it because it's been done that way for 800 years. If you had asked, you know, we would have learned that. And so, yeah, I think it's not making assumptions about people, and being an active listener. So that's a great question.
Okay, Beth, you're up.
Hi, my question is, I know I've been to the markets and so on. Is there a big export market for some of these goods, and or do a lot of these same artisans in New Mexico participate in similar things in other countries? Because my only experience has to do with people coming into New Mexico and having the sale of these kind of goods have a lot to do with tourism, but I'm not clear on whether we do a lot of exporting of these kinds of goods.
Yeah, so actually creative economy accounts for 15% of all exports in New Mexico. That was in a Beaver report. I think the 2014 one probably. And so it is huge. And a lot of the galleries in Albuquerque and Santa Fe, they bring in people from all over the country, sometimes all over the world, to come look at the work. A lot of different galleries are also putting huge online portfolios together. And so I've seen it most recently in Denver. I was working at a gallery, and people would fly in from like the East Coast to look at a specific piece of art that they had been thinking about for a long time. And so, yeah, I mean, so for New Mexico, 15%. And then in general, a lot of galleries are trying to work that, work the relationship online for sales, and that's good. And then in terms of globally, there are actually lots and lots of different arts markets across the world that focus on both like sort of contemporary art and then craft or handmade goods. So the artisans that I used to work with at the folk art market, they would basically be on a circuit all year. And it's like the folk art market in Santa Fe was probably the biggest one they would do every year. And they would save their best products for that market because they knew that they could sell those really high priced items at that market. But they would also make things for markets in Europe. And there was a big one in Paris that I know all the artists would try and go to and things like that. So yeah, great question.
Awesome. I think we have Debbie, then Dave, and Michael's question on chat.
Hi, this is more of just an observation and a comment. You know, speaking to somebody, I don't remember who said it, but said that just because something took a long time to make, it doesn't make it valuable. And I would disagree with that, because I feel like I'm not an artist. I'm totally not creative, but my time is worth something. And I figure that into anything that I do. So I think somebody that's creating something, their time is so much more valuable, and their the effort that they put into it, because I think a lot of artists don't just put, you know, they're not just making something, it means something to them. So when you buy it, you're kind of buying a piece of, not, I don't want to say that you're buying a piece of them, but you're buying something that's intangible. So I would disagree with anybody who says that time doesn't translate into money. I think it does. That's just a comment.
Totally agree, because it's, you know, why is a doctor worth $500 an hour and a philosopher isn't? Or why do we value time differently? And again, I think it comes back to the way our society values different choices and different things. And so, yeah, that's a really great point.
Thank you. We have Dave and then Michael's question on chat.
Hi, good morning. And thank you very much for being here. I know we are speaking more or less about New Mexico art, but someone mentioned that in Japan, they support the artists more in comparison based on cultural need. But in New York, there's places like Soho Village and Washington Square Park and 4th Street and Ashton Village, where art is really growing at a rapid speed. You could on Canal Street and West Side Highway, you could go in a studio there. On the 2nd floor, you could buy art for $1 million, and on the ground floor, you could buy art for $200. It has sculpture, it has all different kind of art. It has clothing art, jersey arts, where they cut up the jerseys in different shapes. And I don't know much about here, but I know in New York, art is really appreciated and people buy art to help artists. There are some artists, if you watch your art and you don't understand it, people just buy it so that the artist could grow. That's my experience with art in New York.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons that art is valued in New York is because it's everywhere, right? I think being exposed to something over and over again helps you understand its value.
Yes.
You know, I think here in Albuquerque, I don't know if everyone's been noticing all the incredible murals that are going up all over town. I think that's a great example of how our city has decided that art is important and valuable, and our business owners have as well. And they say, okay, we're going to support these artists by commissioning them to do these giant murals all over town. And the more we're exposed to those murals or whatever, you know, whether it's maybe the arts crawl that happens downtown the first Friday of every month, that exposure is what I think makes us start to understand and value that stuff. So that's a great point. Yeah, I think that's why New York is so successful in the art scene. That's like the #1 in the US for art. And then because, you know, Santa Fe is #3, which is huge. And I think that's again because culturally we have so many artists who have come to New Mexico to create art. You know, Georgia O'Keeffe was like, you know, one of the most famous ones, of course, who came from the East Coast. So yeah, awesome point.
So really quick, if I will recommend anybody who like art to visit the Soho Film Festival, and you're going to see how many artists is really there, allowed to be there, and they are free. They don't have to pay for rental space or anything like that. And that's a really huge place for art, and they're going for a week or 2 weeks or something like that.
Awesome. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for that, Dave. So then we go back to Michael's question on chat. Art is well known to be therapeutic. What is going on locally in art therapy?
That's a great question. I'm actually not really sure of any local like art therapy things. I know anecdotally, when I was an undergrad, I had to do a senior thesis for the Honors College, and I actually did it on art and therapy. I basically used art as a tool for teenage girls to talk about self-esteem and body image issues, and talk about culture and family, and how that basically impacts their self-worth, and I mean all these things. And so it's definitely a thing. Let's see. Oh yeah. Dr. Montoya mentioned something, the art of revolution. I'm not sure if I remember that.
Yeah, Naomi Natale, she's in town. She actually won an international award. She actually uses art as a way of training people to deal with especially acts of genocide. She did the 1 Million Bones exhibition, I think maybe 6 years ago. Yeah, that's an example, but she works with a cooperative here in town that deals with kind of the therapeutic aspects, and that's her whole thing. I think she's a social worker and a counselor, but also an artist.
Awesome. Yeah, it looks like we've got New Mexico Art Therapy Association, local teen centers, children's law section. Wow, cool. I wasn't super familiar with art therapy in general, but I totally agree. It's a good one. Okay. Other questions? Comments?
I think we have Megan's comment. A little ways up. I read an article recently on investing in art being more valuable and recognized as such than investing in stocks, for example. given the struggles so many artists find simply in living sustainably feels like an exploitation.
What can you maybe explain a little bit what you mean by feeling like an exploitation? Like, are we exploiting the artist? Is that the idea?
I have to find my unmute, sorry. Yeah, I think it feels like an exploitation of the time and energy that artists put into their livelihoods and their work, an undervalue of the individuals. And I think it just speaks to a bigger societal problem or societal norm of how we value work and people, and just what is a right versus what is necessary for living within our country.
Yeah, I agree. I think so many people devalue art because it's not a necessity, right? It's not something that you necessarily need. But then when you, again, you know, if you think about like what would the world be like without art, and it's obviously a much worse place, right? And that's, I guess, a bit of a trope, but I don't think it's untrue. And so, yeah, I guess I would just say I agree with you, I suppose. Yeah.
We're reaching our time here, and I wanted to thank Claire, because Claire can get a conversation moving for about 4 hours if we could, because her questions are really, really vibrant, and I'm not ashamed to say that I'm really proud of having been an instructor for her, because her work is doing some really, really important stuff. So on behalf of the group, thank you very much for your time. I want to bring up a couple of things, because this is something I get passionate about, and it's something that kind of leads us all, I think, to have these really robust conversations. And to Jacob's point, they are actually controversial, and we should actually accept them as such, because these are not easy things. A lot is at stake when people talk about the integration of art with economics. There's a lot at stake. People's dignity, the way that people view history and tradition is embedded a lot in the materiality of art. And as a result of that, I think we have to contend with that. One of the biggest challenges, I think, in the world economy is that for the longest time, we used to consider art some quaint, and craft in particular, some quaint people doing some quaint things in some quaint place. And it wasn't connected or validated as part of a meaningful part of the world shaping aspects of what the world is. And we're actually going to see a lot of this. If you'll afford me this kind of minute to kind of project something. My prediction is right now, I think as a result of the California wildfires, as a result of the extreme politics that we have in this country, I think New Mexico is going to, in the next few years, experience a massive growth in people moving to New Mexico. COVID-19 and the whole idea of the kind of the spaces that are available in Albuquerque. And a lot of this for me is currently anecdotal, but I've heard a lot of people, particularly population studies people that I trust, people are moving to New Mexico in that context. And people are going to move away. Costs of living in San Francisco and other places going to be way too high. And they're going to come to places like New Mexico. And that's going to change a lot of the discourse on who we are and what we represent, and it's going to represent a lot of the challenges that were brought up in this discussion today. So I think there's a lot to talk about. So for our next class, one of the important aspects of this, from my own personal passions, I have been a watchmaker for 15 years. I work on timepieces, mechanical timepieces, and I'm basically going to do a show and tell on one of the videos you're going to see in the next few days. In anticipation of the October 2nd class. But part of that is also going to be how to do a value chain analysis. And that's actually one of the ways in which we can start creating a shared vocabulary about what what you do with intangibility and how you actually make that competitive in a marketplace. So that's coming up immediately in the next class. And it's going to be part of how you guys are going to do a market entry strategy. So Claire is familiar with all this. She's done VRIO analysis the majority of her career. So I might actually draw on her, the way that she's done that in her own work in the next couple of weeks. So, so to Dave's question, do you think you could arrange for Claire to come back later in the semester? If Claire's willing to.
Yeah, you guys had like the best questions. This was really enjoyable for me. And it really helps to talk to people about these things, because writing a dissertation is very, very challenging. And so the more feedback I get and the more I think about this in new ways by answering or attempting to answer your questions is so valuable to me. So thank you. I really appreciate your time.
You know, what I might invite you to do is I'd like to have a conversation with you and with the class about rural cosmopolitanism. That's really, I'm really passionate about that. I was going to do that today, but I actually want to spend some time with you guys I want to do a video before we have this conversation, but I do believe actually that, and I'm not putting a feather in my hat, but I've studied with Nobel Prize winning economists. And one of the things that I learned from some of the best economists in the world is that they're very frustrated with the way economics is used and evoked in the world. It's actually, we're not really kind of doing the full story of how modern economics evolved. Modern economists used to be called, Adam Smith and those dudes, they would never have called themselves economists. They called themselves moral philosophers. And I think we need to kind of take a step back and understand how it is, for example, that rural areas were seen as not important in the making of the world. And actually there's a very real break that happened in the late 17th century that explains a lot of that. So I think we need to think about that and revisit our assumptions about how we evoke economics before we actually get into further conversations. And I know Claire, that's actually a big part of her work. So yeah, Claire, you're coming back. Claire, the sequel.
Sounds good to me. Yeah.
Yeah,
Awesome.
Claire part 2, the search for more information.
Perfect.
Okay.
Working title.
Yeah, it's a working title. It's
Okay.
I'm not a good director or producer, so we'll ask Netflix if they'll do a series on this. Yeah, thank you to Alicia's reaction point there. Applause, everybody. Thank you guys, and thank you, Claire, for everything. It means the world that you were able to kind of spend time on a Saturday with us. And thank you guys for taking your Saturday. As I said, Swedish Institute actually had to kind of move out. And I'm actually going to say they had a pretty good excuse. They actually had to meet with the Nobel Committee about some of the branding they're doing during COVID-19. So yeah, okay. I guess that's okay, man. So I'm going to actually try to get them to maybe talk about branding for the Nobel Prize and see if we can get them to do a presentation on that sometime later on, if possible. Thank you guys. Have a great day. And I'll see you guys on October 2nd.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time.